They called her too ugly to marry, and for years she believed it, until a quiet rancher returned and changed everything. But what began as a simple delivery of books soon became something the whole town would talk about. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The harsh Montana winter of 1885 showed no mercy to the small town of Oak Ridge as Martha Wilson hurried down the muddy main street, clutching her worn shawl tightly against the bitter wind. At 26, Martha had long ago accepted her fate as the town's spinster, the woman everyone whispered was too ugly to marry. Her slightly crooked nose, the result of a childhood fall, and the burn scar that traced from her left cheek to her jawline, had become her defining features to the townsfolk, overshadowing her kind heart and sharp mind. "Morning, Martha," called Mrs. Peterson from the general store's porch, her voice carrying a hint of pity that Martha had grown accustomed to. "Fierce cold today, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mrs. Peterson," Martha replied with a polite nod, quickening her pace toward the schoolhouse where she worked as the teacher's assistant. Inside the schoolhouse, Martha removed her shawl and hung it carefully on the hook by the door. The warmth from the iron stove was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. She began arranging the primers on the children's desks, her movements practiced and efficient. "Did you hear?" whispered Eliza Johnson, the schoolteacher, as she entered the room. "Jacob Thornton is back in town. His brother's passed, and he's taken over the ranch on the North Ridge." Martha vaguely remembered Jacob Thornton, a quiet, serious man who had left Oak Ridge nearly 10 years ago to seek his fortune elsewhere. "That's a shame about his brother," she said softly. "Indeed. Poor Jacob looked so forlorn when he rode into town yesterday," Eliza continued. "A man shouldn't be alone on a ranch that size, especially not one as hardworking as Jacob." Martha nodded absently, having heard similar sentiments countless times before, usually followed by some well-meaning but painful suggestion that she was destined to remain alone. The day passed with the usual lessons and minor squabbles among the children. As Martha was preparing to leave, Eliza placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Martha, would you mind delivering these books to the Thornton Ranch tomorrow? Jacob requested some reading material, and I promised I'd send them along." Martha hesitated. The Thornton Ranch was a good hour's ride outside of town, and she'd have to borrow her father's old mare to make the journey. But the pleading look in Eliza's eyes made her nod in agreement. "Of course, I'll go after school tomorrow." The next afternoon, Martha found herself riding along the snow-dusted trail that led to the Thornton Ranch. The landscape stretched out before her, vast and beautiful, the distant mountains piercing the clear blue sky. The solitude of the ride gave her time to think, to escape the constant whispers and pitying glances that followed her in town. The Thornton Ranch came into view as she rounded a bend in the trail, a solid 2-story house with a large barn and several outbuildings, all well maintained despite Jacob's brother's passing. As she approached, a tall figure emerged from the barn, shielding his eyes against the sun as he watched her approach. "Can I help you, miss?" Jacob Thornton's deep voice carried across the yard as Martha brought the mare to a stop. He was just as she remembered, broad-shouldered and strong, with serious eyes that seemed to see more than most. "Mr. Thornton," Martha acknowledged with a slight nod. "I'm Martha Wilson. I've brought the books Miss Johnson promised you." Recognition flickered across his weathered face. "Martha Wilson ... James Wilson's daughter? You used to help at the church socials, if I recall correctly." Martha was surprised he remembered her. Most people in town saw only her scars. "Yes, that's right. Come inside, please." "It's too cold to be standing out here," Jacob said, stepping forward to help her dismount. His hands were strong and calloused as they briefly touched her waist, but his touch was respectful, gentle even. The interior of the house was neat but spare, with a large fireplace dominating the main room. "Would you care for some coffee, Miss Wilson? I just made a fresh pot." "That would be lovely, thank you," Martha replied, surprised by his hospitality. In town, few people invited her to linger in their homes, as though her unmarried status and scarred face might somehow be contagious. As Jacob busied himself with the coffee, Martha noticed the emptiness of the house. No personal touches. No photographs, nothing to suggest that this was a home rather than simply a shelter. "Have you been away from Oakridge all this time?" Martha asked as Jacob handed her a steaming cup. He nodded, settling into a chair across from her. "I went north to the Montana Territories, worked on several ranches, saved every penny. I had plans to buy my own spread someday." A shadow crossed his face. "Never thought I'd come back to claim my brothers." "I'm sorry for your loss," Martha said sincerely. "Thank you." Jacob's eyes met hers, and for once, Martha didn't see pity or discomfort, only a shared understanding of grief. "It's a good ranch, but it's too much for one man to handle. I've been thinking of hiring help, but good ranch hands are hard to come by in winter." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing more easily than Martha had experienced in years. Jacob spoke of his time away, and Martha told him about the changes in Oakridge. Not once did he stare at her scar or look away uncomfortably. As Martha prepared to leave, Jacob helped her back onto her horse. "Thank you for bringing the books, Miss Wilson. And for the company. It gets mighty quiet out here." "It was my pleasure, Mr. Thornton," Martha replied, surprised to find that she meant it. "Perhaps." Jacob hesitated, his hand resting briefly on the mare's bridle. "Perhaps you wouldn't mind bringing more books next week? If it's not too much trouble, that is." Martha felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "I wouldn't mind at all, Mr. Thornton." As she rode back toward town, Martha couldn't help but think that Jacob Thornton had seen her, truly seen her, not as the town's scarred spinster, but simply as herself. The thought brought a smile to her face that lasted all the way home. The following weeks brought a routine that Martha had never expected to enjoy so much. Every Saturday, she would ride out to the Thornton Ranch with a new selection of books, and each time, Jacob would welcome her with a fresh pot of coffee and increasingly comfortable conversation. "You've brought quite the selection today," Jacob remarked one crisp March afternoon as Martha unpacked several volumes from her saddlebag. The winter was slowly releasing its grip on the land, patches of green beginning to emerge from beneath the melting snow. "I thought you might enjoy some variety," Martha replied, smoothing her skirt as she sat in what had become her chair by the fire. "Mr. Livingston at the bookshop was kind enough to lend these from his personal collection." Jacob's hands, rough from ranch work, but surprisingly gentle with the books, carefully examined a volume of Whitman's poetry. "My mother used to read poetry in the evenings," he said softly. "I'd almost forgotten how much I enjoyed it." Martha watched him, noticing how the lines around his eyes softened when he spoke of pleasant memories. At their first meetings, she had been careful to keep her scarred side turned away from him, a habit formed from years of trying to minimize others' discomfort. But Jacob had never seemed to notice, or if he did, he gave no indication that her appearance bothered him. "How are the preparations for spring coming along?" Martha asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Slowly but surely," Jacob sighed, settling back in his chair. "I've managed to hire 2 hands from the next county, but we're still short-handed for the calving season." He paused, looking at her directly. "Actually, Miss Wilson, I've been meaning to ask you something." Martha's heart fluttered unexpectedly. "Yes?" "I notice you're good with figures. I've seen the accounts you keep for the school. Would you consider helping me organize the ranch books? My brother's system was, well, there wasn't much of a system at all. I'd pay you fairly, of course." It wasn't what Martha had been expecting, though she couldn't quite admit to herself what she had been hoping for. Still, the offer was appealing. "I'd be happy to help, Mr. Thornton. Perhaps I could come by after school a couple of days a week." Jacob's face brightened. "That would be a tremendous help, Miss Wilson." "Thank you." As April arrived, Martha found herself at the Thornton Ranch 3 days a week, seated at the solid oak table in the kitchen, papers spread before her as she created order from the chaotic records Jacob's brother had left behind. Jacob would often work alongside her, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they pored over figures and invoices. News of their arrangement quickly spread through Oakridge. bringing with it the inevitable whispers. "Did you hear about Martha Wilson and the Thornton widower?" Martha overheard Mrs. Bennet say to Mrs. Peterson outside the general store. "Spending all that time alone together at his ranch. Hardly proper, if you ask me. Well, who else would have her?" Mrs. Peterson had replied with a dismissive wave. "Poor man's probably desperate for help with the ranch. Even Martha Wilson is better than no one at all." The words stung, despite Martha's years of practice at ignoring such comments. That evening at the ranch, she was quieter than usual, her pen moving methodically across the ledger as she tried to focus on the task rather than the gossip. "Is something troubling you, Martha?" Jacob asked, using her first name as he had begun to do in recent weeks. His voice was gentle, concerned. Martha hesitated. "It's nothing, truly." Jacob's hand covered hers, stilling her pen. "I've come to know you well enough to recognize when something's amiss." The unexpected warmth of his touch and the sincerity in his eyes broke through her defenses. "The town is talking," she admitted quietly, "about my time spent here. They think it's improper." Jacob's expression darkened. "People will always talk. Does it bother you greatly?" Martha looked down at their hands, still touching on the table. "Not the impropriety they imagine, but their assumptions about why you might tolerate my company." "Tolerate?" Jacob's voice held a note of surprise. "Martha, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, steeling herself for the pity she was accustomed to seeing. "I don't tolerate your company. I cherish it," Jacob said firmly. "These past weeks have been the first time since returning that this place has felt like a home. Not just my brother's legacy." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest, but doubt still lingered. "You're kind to say so, but—" "It's not kindness, it's truth," Jacob interrupted, his hand tightening slightly around hers. "The people in town, they see what they want to see. They don't know me, and from what you've told me, they've never truly known you either." Martha swallowed hard, fighting the unexpected emotion rising in her throat. "Most people find it difficult to see past ... She gestured vaguely toward her scarred cheek. Jacob's eyes followed the movement, then returned to meet her gaze steadily. "I see a woman who's intelligent, kind, and stronger than most men I've known. A woman who's faced cruelty with dignity and still manages to be gentle with those children at the school." His voice dropped slightly. "A beautiful woman, Martha." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Martha felt tears threatening and blinked them away. No one had ever called her beautiful before, not since the accident that had left her scarred at the age of 12. "You don't need to say such things," she whispered. "I've never been one for saying things I don't mean," Jacob replied, a hint of stubbornness in his tone. "That's one thing ranch life teaches you, the value of plain speaking." A small smile tugged at Martha's lips despite herself. "You are rather direct, Mr. Thornton." "Jacob," he corrected, his own mouth curving in response. "I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" Their eyes held for a long moment, something new and fragile building between them. Finally, Martha nodded. "Jacob, then." The sound of hooves outside broke the moment. Jacob reluctantly released her hand and went to the window. "It's Tom Jenkins with that repaired harness I've been waiting for," he said, moving toward the door. "I'll just be a moment." Left alone, Martha pressed her hand to her cheek, feeling the raised texture of her scar beneath her fingertips. For the first time in years, she wondered if perhaps the mark that had defined her life might not determine her future after all. When Jacob returned, they resumed their work, but something had shifted between them, a barrier fallen, a possibility acknowledged. As Martha prepared to leave that evening, Jacob helped her with her shawl, his hands lingering briefly on her shoulders. "Will you come for dinner tomorrow?" he asked, his voice holding a note of uncertainty that seemed out of place in such a confident man. "Not for the books or accounts, just ... for the company." Martha turned to face him, summoning a courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I'd like that very much, Jacob." The smile that spread across his weathered face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm, bright, and full of promise. May brought with it an explosion of wildflowers across the Montana landscape. painting the previously barren fields in vibrant purples, yellows, and blues. The transformation of the land seemed to mirror the blossoming relationship between Martha and Jacob, which had grown steadily since that evening in April when truth had been spoken and possibilities acknowledged. Martha stood on the front porch of the Thornton Ranch, watching as Jacob instructed one of his newly hired hands on mending a section of fence. The easy authority in his movements, the respect shown by the younger man, these were things she had come to admire about Jacob. He was a natural leader, firm but fair, demanding quality work while treating his men with dignity. "Miss Wilson," called a cheerful voice, drawing Martha's attention to Ethan Cooper, the 13-year-old son of Jacob's foreman who had joined his father at the ranch when school let out for planting season. "Pa says to tell you the pies are cooling in the kitchen if you want to check on them." Martha smiled warmly at the boy. "Thank you, Ethan. How are you finding ranch life compared to town?" Ethan's face lit up. "It's the best, Miss Wilson. Mr. Thornton's teaching me to rope, and Pa says if I work hard this summer, I might get my own colt to train." "That sounds wonderful," Martha replied, genuinely pleased for the enthusiastic boy. "Just don't forget your reading. Remember, you promised to finish Treasure Island before returning to school." Ethan nodded earnestly. "I will, Miss Wilson. Mr. Thornton reads some to me in the evening sometimes, when the work is done." The image of Jacob sitting with the boy, sharing the adventure stories that had captivated generations of young minds, warmed Martha's heart. Jacob had revealed many surprising sides to his character over the past months: his love of poetry, his quiet philanthropy toward struggling families in the area, and now his patience with a young boy's education. Inside the kitchen, Martha found Mrs. Cooper, the foreman's wife, removing the last pie from the oven. The Cooper family's presence at the ranch had been a blessing, bringing life and energy to the previously quiet homestead. It had also provided a respectable buffer against the town's gossip about Martha's frequent visits. "Those smell divine, Mrs. Cooper," Martha said appreciatively. The older woman smiled, her round face flushed from the heat of the oven. "Just in time for the Founders' Day celebration tomorrow. The men will be mighty pleased to have something sweet after all that barbecue." The annual Oak Ridge Founders' Day picnic was the highlight of the spring social calendar, a time when the entire community gathered to commemorate the town's establishment. This year, for the first time in nearly a decade, the Thornton Ranch would be participating fully, with Jacob having donated a steer for the barbecue. "Will you be riding into town with us in the morning, Martha?" Mrs. Cooper asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought I might help Jacob, mister Thornton, with loading the supplies," Martha replied, moving to assist with covering the cooling pies. Mrs. Cooper's eyes twinkled knowingly. "He certainly lights up when you're around, dear. I haven't known him long, but Samuel says he's never seen the boss so content." Martha felt a blush warming her cheeks. "We enjoy each other's company," she said simply, unwilling to put into words the delicate understanding that had been building between her and Jacob. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, Martha and Jacob walked along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the Thornton property. These walks had become a cherished ritual, a time when they could speak freely away from curious ears. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Jacob asked, his hand occasionally brushing against hers as they navigated the uneven ground. Martha considered the question carefully. "A little," she admitted. "It will be the first time we've been seen together so publicly." Jacob stopped, turning to face her fully. "Does that concern you, what people might say?" The genuine worry in his expression touched her. "Not for myself," she said truthfully. "I've lived with their whispers for years. But you've only just returned and established yourself again. I wouldn't want to be the cause of any difficulty." Jacob's laugh held no humor. "Martha, I've never much cared what the good people of Oak Ridge thought of me, even before I left. That hasn't changed." His expression softened as he reached out to take her hand deliberately in his. "What matters to me is what you think, how you feel." Martha looked down at their joined hands, his large and sun-darkened, hers smaller and pale in comparison. "I think you're a good man, Jacob Thornton." The best man I've ever known. That's not exactly what I was asking, Jacob said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. With his free hand, he gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Martha Wilson, I've grown to care for you deeply these past months. I hope that you might feel similarly. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Despite the growing closeness between them, despite the lingering touches and meaningful glances, neither had spoken so directly of their feelings before this moment. I do, she whispered, finding courage in the warmth of his eyes. Care for you, that is. More than I thought possible. The smile that spread across Jacob's face was like nothing Martha had ever seen. It transformed his usually serious features, making him appear younger, almost boyish in his joy. Then the rest of Oakridge can talk themselves blue in the face for all I care. His hand moved from her chin to her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the line of her scar, with such tenderness that Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. No one had ever touched her scar deliberately before. People either pretended it didn't exist or avoided looking at it altogether. Jacob, she began, uncertain what she meant to say. You're beautiful, Martha, he said softly, echoing his words from that pivotal evening months ago. Every part of you. Before she could respond, he lowered his head and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief, almost reverential, but it sent a current of warmth through Martha's entire body. When Jacob pulled back, his eyes searched hers, asking a silent question. Martha answered by raising herself on tiptoes and returning the kiss with a sweetness that belied the years of longing she had buried beneath practicality and resignation. When they finally parted, Jacob's arms had somehow found their way around her waist, holding her close. I never expected this, Martha confessed, allowing herself to rest her head against his solid chest. Not for me. Jacob's arms tightened around her. I came back to Oakridge expecting only duty and memories, he murmured into her hair. Instead, I found you. A fresh start. A future I can look forward to. They stood together as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the land that Jacob had inherited and was making his own, with Martha increasingly by his side. We should head back, Jacob said eventually, though he made no move to release her. The Coopers will wonder where we've gone. Martha nodded reluctantly, stepping back but keeping hold of his hand. Tomorrow will be interesting, she said with a small smile. Indeed it will, Jacob agreed, bringing her hand to his lips for a brief kiss before they turned back toward the ranch house, walking close together as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Neither could have predicted just how interesting the Founders' Day celebration would prove to be, nor how it would force them both to confront the past that had shaped them, and the future they now dared to imagine together. The morning of Founders' Day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed created specifically for outdoor celebrations. Martha stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, examining her appearance with a critical eye that had been honed by years of anticipating others' reactions. She had chosen her best dress for the occasion, a deep blue cotton with delicate white piping that her mother had insisted brought out the color of her eyes. For the first time in years, Martha found herself wondering what Jacob would think when he saw her. The thought brought a smile to her face and a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the scar that marked her left side. Martha, are you nearly ready? Her father called from downstairs. James Wilson had been quietly supportive of his daughter's blossoming relationship with Jacob Thornton, though he'd said little beyond observing that Jacob seemed a solid sort of fellow. Coming, father. Martha called back, pinning her hat securely and gathering her shawl despite the warmth of the day. Some habits of self-protection were difficult to break. The town square was already bustling with activity when Martha and her father arrived. Tables had been set up beneath the old oak trees. Ladies were arranging their contributions to the community feast, and men were tending to the large pit where Jacob's donated steer was slowly roasting, filling the air with a mouth-watering aroma. Martha's eyes scanned the crowd automatically, searching for Jacob. She spotted the Coopers near the lemonade stand, but no sign of Jacob himself. A mixture of disappointment and relief washed over her. Part of her had hoped to have him by her side when facing the town, while another part dreaded the inevitable whispers their appearance together would generate. "Martha Wilson, there you are!" Eliza Johnson approached, her face alight with the excitement of the celebration. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come. The children have been asking for you. They want to show you the historical display they created for the schoolhouse booth." Martha allowed herself to be drawn toward the far corner of the square, where her students had proudly arranged artifacts and hand-drawn pictures depicting Oak Ridge's history. She lost herself in their enthusiasm, praising their work and answering their eager questions. It was nearly noon when a collective murmur from the crowd drew her attention to the arrival of a wagon bearing the Thornton Ranch mark. Jacob sat tall on the driver's bench, handling the team of horses with confident ease. Beside him sat old Thomas Cooper, while in the back of the wagon, Mrs. Cooper and young Ethan were surrounded by covered dishes and baskets. The sight of Jacob freshly shaved, wearing a crisp white shirt and his best dark coat, made Martha's heart beat faster. As the wagon came to a stop, Jacob handed the reins to Thomas and jumped down, his eyes immediately searching the crowd until they found Martha. The smile that spread across his face at the sight of her was unmistakable, visible to anyone watching, and many were. Martha felt the weight of dozens of curious gazes as Jacob made his way directly toward her, weaving through the crowd with determination. The children around her fell silent, watching with wide eyes as the tall rancher approached their teacher's assistant. "Miss Wilson," Jacob greeted her formally, though his eyes conveyed a much more intimate message. "You look lovely today." "Mr. Thornton," Martha returned, suddenly acutely aware of their audience. "Thank you for coming, and for your generous donation to the celebration." Jacob's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, amusement at their public formality evident in his expression. "I wouldn't have missed it. Would you do me the honor of walking with me? I believe they're about to announce the beginning of the feast." Before Martha could respond, a sharp voice cut through their exchange. "Well, if it isn't Jacob Thornton, finally returning to civilized society." Beatrice Montgomery, the widow of Oak Ridge's former mayor and self-appointed arbiter of social standards, approached with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. And in such unexpected company, Martha felt herself stiffen, the familiar shame threatening to rise within her. But before she could retreat into her habitual silence, Jacob's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a public declaration that left no room for misinterpretation. "Mrs. Montgomery," Jacob acknowledged with a curt nod. "I count myself fortunate indeed to be in Miss Wilson's company. If you'll excuse us, I believe we're needed at the serving tables." Without waiting for a response, Jacob guided Martha away, his grip on her hand firm and reassuring. "I apologize if that was too forward," he murmured as they moved through the crowd. "But I won't have anyone speaking to you with that tone. Not today, not ever." Martha squeezed his hand gratefully, finding courage in his unwavering support. "Thank you," she whispered. The afternoon progressed with a strange mixture of warmth and tension. Many in the town responded to Jacob and Martha as a couple with genuine pleasure. Martha's father beamed approvingly. Eliza Johnson offered heartfelt congratulations, and the children seemed delighted to see their Miss Wilson happy. Others, however, watched with narrowed eyes and whispered behind raised hands, the novelty of the scarred spinster and the returned rancher providing irresistible fodder for gossip. As they sat together at one of the long tables, enjoying the community feast, Martha became aware of a conversation at the neighboring table, voices not quite low enough to avoid being overheard. Must be desperate for a housekeeper. Taking up with that Wilson girl. Heard his ranch is struggling. Probably hoping James Wilson will invest. Can you imagine what their children might look like, with her face? Martha's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. Jacob, noticing immediately, followed her gaze to the group of women who were now openly staring at them. His jaw tightened and he began to rise, but Martha placed a restraining hand on his arm. "No, Jacob, please. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You matter to me. A hush fell over the nearby tables as Jacob stood, his imposing figure drawing attention. Martha's heart raced. Surely he wasn't going to confront the gossips directly? But instead of approaching the women, Jacob turned to face Martha, dropping to one knee beside her seat. The entire gathering seemed to collectively hold its breath as Jacob took Martha's hand in his. "I had planned to do this privately," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "But perhaps this is better. Martha Wilson, from the moment you rode up to my ranch with those books, you brought light back into my life." Martha felt tears welling in her eyes, unable to believe what was happening. "Jacob... You saw me, not as the Thornton heir or the returned prodigal, but simply as a man trying to find his way." Jacob continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I see you not as others foolishly do, but as the strong, beautiful, compassionate woman you are." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple band with a modest diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. "I love you, Martha Wilson. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, Jacob's earnest face upturned to hers, the weight of years of loneliness and acceptance of her supposed fate suddenly lifting from Martha's shoulders. In that moment, she didn't hear the gasps from the crowd or see the shocked expressions surrounding them. She saw only Jacob, offering her not just a ring, but a future she had never dared to imagine. "Yes," she whispered, then louder as joy bubbled up within her. "Yes, Jacob Thornton, I will marry you." Jacob's face broke into that rare, transformative smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was standing, pulling her up into his arms, uncaring of the hundreds of eyes watching as he kissed her tenderly. When they finally separated, the silence was broken by a single pair of hands clapping Martha's father, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. Eliza Johnson joined him, then Thomas Cooper and his family, and suddenly the entire gathering erupted in applause, some genuine, some merely polite, but applause nonetheless. As Jacob kept his arm firmly around Martha's waist, people began to approach them, some offering sincere congratulations, others clearly reassessing their previous judgments in light of Jacob's public declaration. Even Mrs. Montgomery managed a tight nod in their direction, though she refrained from direct congratulations. "Are you all right?" Jacob murmured against Martha's ear as the well-wishers continued to surround them. "I know this wasn't how we planned things." Martha looked up at him, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "I've never been better," she replied truthfully. "Though I think you've scandalized half the town." Jacob's laugh was rich and warm. "Let them talk. They'll have plenty more to discuss when they see what we make of the Thornton Ranch together." As the sun began its descent, casting long golden rays across the town square, Martha stood beside Jacob, his arm still protectively around her waist, her father beaming proudly nearby. For the first time in her life, she didn't turn her scarred cheek away from those who approached, didn't hunch her shoulders to appear smaller or less noticeable. Instead, she stood tall beside the man who had chosen her, who had seen beyond the surface to the person beneath, who had publicly declared his love in a way that no one in Oak Ridge could misinterpret or diminish. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked softly as they watched the children playing a game of tag around the old oak tree. Martha considered the question, her hand covering his where it rested at her waist. The unfamiliar weight of the ring on her finger, a constant, joyful reminder of the day's events. "I'm thinking about tomorrow," she said finally. "And all the tomorrows after that." Jacob's eyes, warm and full of promise, met hers. "Our tomorrows," he corrected gently. "Yes," Martha agreed, leaning into his solid presence beside her. "Our tomorrows." The whispers would continue, she knew. Some in town would never fully accept that Jacob Thornton had chosen the too ugly to marry Martha Wilson. But for the first time in her life, Martha found that she truly didn't care. The only opinion that mattered was that of the man beside her, the man who looked at her scars and saw strength, who had offered her his heart and his name, who had changed forever the story of her life with his love. As they walked together toward the wagon that would carry them back to the ranch. Their ranch now, Martha realized that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to the most beautiful destinations. And sometimes, a person needed to be truly seen before they could see themselves clearly. Jacob had given her that gift, and she would spend the rest of their lives together returning it in kind.